In a lab in Bristol, a scientist pushes a hair-thin electrode into a mushroom and turns on a recorder. Nothing should happen. It's a mushroom. But the screen starts to move, sharp, rhythmic spikes of electricity rolling out one after another. And the pattern on that screen is a problem because it's the same kind of spike a neuron fires inside your brain. The mushroom has no neurons. It has no brain at all, but it's still doing it. That signal is the thread worth pulling on because it leads somewhere most people never go when they hear the comforting story about the forest. You've probably heard that one already. Underneath the trees, fungal threads wrap around roots and wire the whole forest together into a single connected system. People call it nature's internet. The headline writes itself, the documentaries love it, and you have almost certainly nodded along to it. Here's the part nobody slows down on. The word internet is hiding something. An internet is not just a bunch of cables. An internet is a thing that carries signals, messages, information moving from one point to another and meaning something when it arrives. So the interesting question was not whether the trees are wired together. They are. The threads are real, the connections are real, and you can dig them up and look at them. The interesting question is the one almost nobody asks, the one that hides behind that cute little metaphor and never gets answered. What is actually traveling down the wires? And when scientists finally went looking for the answer, they didn't find sap or water or chemical mush sliding along like food through a gut. They found electricity, organized electricity, the kind that in any other organism on Earth we would call thinking. Start with the spikes because the spikes are where it stops being a nature story and starts being something you can't quite shake. A researcher named Andrew Adamatsky did something almost nobody had bothered to do. He stuck microelectrodes directly into living fungi and just listened. Not to the mushroom you see above ground. That's only the fruiting tip, the part that pokes up to release spores. He went after the mycelium, the vast web of threads underneath that the mushroom grows out of, the actual body of the organism. And what came back was not silence, and it was not noise. It was a stream of electrical pulses, rising and falling in trains that looked uncannily like the action potentials nerve cells use to talk to each other. Think about how strange that is. The action potential, the electrical spike, is supposed to be the signature of a nervous system. It's the thing your neurons do. It's how a brain has a thought, how a hand pulls back from a flame, how a memory gets written down. It is the basic unit of biological information on this planet. And here it was, firing through an organism that split off from the animal lineage over 1 billion years ago and never built a single nerve to its name. The spikes had a texture to them too, and the details are where it gets eerie. They were tiny, fractions of 1,000th of a volt, which is part of why nobody had caught them for so long. And they were slow, brutally, alienly slow. A single one of these electrical spikes could last anywhere from about an hour to almost a full day. Sit with that. If this is a language, it is a language where one syllable can take 21 hours to pronounce. A creature speaking on a timescale so far from ours that an entire fungal sentence might take a week to finish and we'd never notice it happening under our feet. And the spikes weren't random. They responded to the world. Feed the fungus and the pattern changed. Injure it and the pattern changed again. The mycelium was registering events in its environment and answering them in a language of voltage. Different species had their own rhythms, some firing in slow, irregular swells, others snapping out faster, sharper bursts, each with a kind of accent of its own. The threads under the forest weren't just connected, they were active. They were reacting. They were, in some sense, nobody can quite pin down, saying something. The only question left was whether saying was the right word, and that's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Adamatsky took the recordings and did something that sounds absurd until you see the result. He treated the electrical spikes like text. He noticed the spikes didn't come out evenly. They clustered, grouping together into trains, then pausing, then grouping again, the way letters bunch into words with spaces between them. So he asked a blunt question. What if those clusters are words? He ran the patterns through the same kind of mathematical analysis you'd use to study a human language. He measured how long each cluster was, how often particular ones repeated, how they were spaced across hours and days, and the numbers came back looking disturbingly familiar. The fungal words had a distribution of lengths that lined up with the distribution of word lengths in human languages, the same statistical fingerprint our speech leaves behind. The mycelium seemed to be working with a vocabulary. By his count, up to around 50 distinct units, with a smaller core set of maybe 15 or 20 that came up again and again. The same way you actually live on a few hundred everyday words and almost never reach for the rest of the dictionary. One species stood out, a common, unremarkable-looking fungus called the split gill, the kind of thing you'd step over on a rotting log without a second glance, produced the most complex patterns of all, the richest structure. The longest strings, if strings is even the right idea. Of every fungus he tested, the most ordinary one was apparently the most articulate. Now, the honest problem with all of this, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets stripped of its caveats and flattened into a headline. Scientists prove mushrooms talk. A lot of serious researchers think Adamatsky is reaching, and their objection is a good one. An electrical spike is not a word just because you can count it like one. Rivers have rhythms, heartbeats have rhythms, weather has patterns you can run statistics on. Finding mathematical structure in a signal is not the same as proving the signal carries meaning, and dressing it up in the vocabulary of grammar and lexicons and sentences might be telling us more about the human craving to find a conversation everywhere we look than about the fungus itself. That criticism is correct. Hold on to it, and then notice that it doesn't make the underlying fact go away. Strip out the word language entirely. Refuse to call a single spike a word. Throw out the grammar, the lexicon, all of it. You are still left with this. An organism with no nervous system is generating structured, responsive, electrical signals across a network that can stretch for miles underground. Whatever you decide to name that, it is not nothing. It is information moving through a living thing that, by every rule we were taught, has no machinery to process information at all. So the forest internet has traffic on it, real, measurable traffic. The next thing you'd want to know is what kind of creature is generating the signal, and that answer is its own small horror. Go back to that split gill fungus, the one with the most complex signals. Look at how it reproduces, and the ground shifts under you a little. You have two sexes. Most animals do. A handful of organisms get strange and run 3 or 4 mating types. The split gill fungus has more than 28,000. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration. Over 28,000 distinct sexes, almost any of which can pair with almost any other. The arithmetic of its love life is something no human framework was ever built to hold, a number so far outside our categories that male and female isn't even a rounding error against it. This is the thing people quietly skip when they picture the forest internet as a warm little network of trees holding hands. The organism running that network is not a slightly unusual plant. It isn't a plant at all. It's a member of a kingdom that branched away from everything you find intuitive about life an almost incomprehensibly long time ago, and went off to invent its own rules for sex, for what counts as a body, for where one individual ends and the next begins, and now, apparently, for signaling. Pair that with the timescale, those hour-long, day-long spikes, and the picture that emerges isn't a forest gently chatting with itself. It's the slow electrical output of something genuinely alien, thinking, or doing whatever the brainless version of thinking is, in geological slow motion, underground, we cross without a thought every single day. And the place we mapped most of this? That's the next thing that should bother you about the story you've been handed. Here's the quiet embarrassment buried inside the whole jungle internet idea. Almost none of the famous research came from a jungle. The experiments that built this entire legend, the ones that launched 1,000 documentaries about trees talking and sharing and warning each other, were mostly run in cool, damp, temperate forests. The single most influential body of work came out of the Douglas fir forests of Western Canada. Conifers, cold climate evergreens. The kind of forest you'd hike through in the Pacific Northwest in a rain jacket, not the kind dripping with vines and loud with insects. The headline picture in your mind, a steaming tropical rainforest secretly glowing with one connected web, is, scientifically, set in the wrong place. The story slipped loose from its evidence and went hunting for a more cinematic backdrop. It's a tale about Canadian fir trees wearing the costume of the Amazon. That detail matters more than it looks, because it tells you exactly how this field slides from measurement into mythology. The Trees Talk version got a little prettier and a little bolder every time it was retold, until the careful science underneath nearly disappeared. And the electrical spiking version is starting down the same road right now. The headlines already promise fungal conversations and underground wisdom and secret forest mines, which is precisely why it's worth gripping the boring, sturdy, genuinely strange core fact and refusing to let it inflate. Structured electrical signals in an organism with no brain, real enough to catch on the end of a wire. Because once you actually accept that fact, really let it land, a much bigger question cracks open. And this is the one that dragged the whole thing out of biology and dropped it into computer science. If a fungus fires the same electrical spikes a neuron does, and those spikes respond to the world and they travel through a network, can the network compute? That is not a rhetorical flourish. There are people actively trying to find out, and they are succeeding. The same lab that recorded the spikes started asking whether mycelium could be made to work the way silicon does. The logic of it is almost too clean. A computer chip works by pushing electrical signals through a material and reading what comes out the other side. A spike is a 1, no spike is a 0. And from billions of those simple switches, you get everything. This sentence, the device you're holding, the entire digital world. Mycelium pushes electrical signals through itself too. So the researchers wired straight into a living fungal colony, fed electrical inputs into one set of points and read the outputs from another, and waited to see if the fungus would do anything that resembled logic. It did. They got logic gates. Real ones, the fundamental building blocks every computer is made of, the tiny switches that turn inputs into decisions. Built not out of etched silicon, but out of a living, growing fungus. They've pulled it off with oyster mushrooms and with common molds, and they found something even stranger in the process. Different species with different physical shapes of network naturally computed different logical functions. The raw geometry of the threads was doing the math. The shape of the organism was the circuit. The head of that lab puts it in a line that should stop you cold. Mycelium, he says, works at the same time as a sensor, a processor, and a structural material. Read that again, slowly. One single substance that feels its environment computes a response to it and is also the physical wall holding the structure up. Imagine a brick that is also a brain. That's not science fiction set dressing, that's the actual pitch. His lab was founded on the belief that the computers of this century would be grown, not manufactured, living systems working alongside silicon, and they grow theirs on cheap junk, on sawdust and straw and cardboard. Because the fungus doesn't need a clean room, it needs lunch. And it doesn't just react in the instant, it holds on to things. Stimulate the fungus in the right way, and its electrical behavior changes and stays changed, which is a primitive form of memory. The threads remember what happened to them. The researchers describe it as something close to how your own brain wears a habit into place. Do the thing once and it's effortful. Do it enough times and the pathway is just there, waiting. You can even steer the whole network as it grows, coaxing it with chemical attractants and repellents, programming a living thing by telling it where it wants to go. And because it's alive, it can adapt and heal and keep growing after you've built with it. So this is no longer a metaphor. The claim is not that the forest is like a computer. The claim is that the exact biological material running underneath the forest can be wired up and made to compute. That humans, right now in 2026, are growing the first crude motherboards out of mushroom. They call it wetware, living tissue doing the job of a chip. And the fungus is not some lonely curiosity in that field. There are companies selling access to processors built from lab-grown human brain cells, little clusters of neurons wired into silicon and rented out by the hour. There are commercial machines that fuse living brain tissue with a chip and let it learn in real time. The bleeding edge of computing is racing to build thinking matter out of biology, and sitting right there in that same serious conversation, treated as a genuine contender, is the thing that grows on a dead log. Now stand back and put the two halves together, because this is the part that quietly rearranges how you see the ground you're standing on. We spent years congratulating ourselves on a clever little metaphor. The forest has an internet. How charming, how poetic. We meant it as a figure of speech, a cute way of saying these organisms happen to be connected, sort of like our machines are connected. We had it exactly backwards. The connection was never the metaphor. The computation is the literal part. The thing under the forest fires the same electrical spikes our neurons fire. It carries structured signals across a network. It senses, it responds, it appears to hold a crude kind of memory, and we can borrow it, wire into it, and make it run logic. Which means our newest, most futuristic technology, the bleeding edge, the living chips we are only barely learning to grow, turns out to be a clumsy, deliberate, late attempt to copy what that fungus has been doing entirely on its own, with no engineer, no blueprint, no funding, and no off switch, since long before anything resembling a forest existed to grow in. The internet was never the thing we invented, and the forest faintly echoed. The forest is the thing that was already running in the dark for an unthinkable stretch of time. And we are the ones reverse engineering it now, one electrode at a time, trying to reconstruct a working system we have been standing on top of for the entire history of our species. And the most honest scientists in that lab will tell you the same uncomfortable thing. They can measure the spikes, they can build the gates, they can grow the motherboard. What they cannot yet do is read it, cannot tell you what, if anything, the network under your feet is actually working out, what it senses, what it's deciding, whether all that slow electrical traffic adds up to nothing at all, or to something we don't have a word for because we've never had to need one. There is a living, signaling, computing thing threaded through the soil beneath almost every forest on the planet. It has been there the whole time, firing its hour-long spikes into the dark while we walked over it. And we have only just figured out how to listen, only to discover that we don't speak the language.